Imagine being 15 years old, ripped from your homeland, sold naked in front of strangers, and forced into a windowless cell where you'll be exploited by 30 men a day until your body breaks. This wasn't a dark secret of Rome. It was the foundation of its society. The Roman Empire, the same civilization that gave us aqueducts, concrete and law, also perfected industrialized sexual slavery on a scale the world had never seen before. Here, we're uncovering what Roman sex slaves really endured, and why this part of history still matters today. Before we dive in, I want you to do something simple. Comment below what time it is where you are watching this right now. It helps this channel massively, and lets us see how far this history travels across the world. When most people picture Rome, they imagine marble temples, mighty legions, and philosophers in togas. But behind the triumphal arches and heroic statues lies a truth Rome preferred to hide. It was built on bodies. 1 in 3 people in Rome were slaves, and of those, thousands existed solely for sexual use. From licensed brothels in the heart of the capital, to private delicia boys and girls in elite households, Rome normalized something we would recognize today as systemic sexual exploitation. What's shocking isn't only that this happened, but how utterly ordinary it was. Fathers took their sons to brothels staffed by slaves as a rite of passage. Noble women kept young male slaves for their private pleasure. Even moral philosophers like Seneca, who spoke of treating slaves kindly, thought nothing of owning human beings for sex. To understand the Roman world, we have to strip away the romantic myths and look unflinchingly at the brutality that made their glory possible, and it begins in the slave markets. The beating heart of Rome's slave economy was the forum where auctions took place daily. War captives, kidnapped villagers, and children stolen from frontiers stood on wooden platforms, branded and displayed like livestock. Buyers examined them, prodding their muscles, checking their teeth, and in the case of those destined for brothels, staring at their bodies to judge desirability. Picture the scene. A 15-year-old girl from Gaul stands trembling as the auctioneer forces her to spin slowly. The crowd whistles at her youth. Her price soars. Within minutes, she sells for 20 times what a farm laborer would cost. Her new owner isn't looking for a cook or a cleaner. He runs one of Rome's 45 licensed brothels. Her life from that day forward will be measured in the number of men who pay for her body before disease or despair claims her. This wasn't exceptional. This was the system. Tens of thousands of girls and boys were trafficked through these markets every year. War victories created floods of human cargo. After Caesar's conquest of Gaul, it's said that so many slaves entered the markets that prices collapsed overnight. And for those marked as sexual stock, their fates were sealed. Some would end up in brothels, others in elite homes, and a few in the strange middle ground of concubinage. Roman brothels were nothing like the red velvet fantasies you might imagine. They were cramped, dark, and foul. Cells barely big enough to lie down in lined the hallways. A crude curtain was the only privacy. Slaves here served up to 30 clients a day. There was no choice, no break, no protection. Suicide was so common that brothel owners barred the windows and removed anything that could serve as a noose. If a slave managed to kill themselves, the owner mourned only the lost investment. Survival strategies emerged. Some slaves gave themselves different names for each client, a way of fragmenting their identities to endure. Others faked enthusiasm, hoping for tips to bribe guards or buy scraps of freedom. Many withdrew so completely into themselves that Roman writers described them as the walking dead. Diseases spread unchecked. Injuries from violent clients went untreated. Medical text from the period describes sowing tears with cold detachment, not to heal, but to return the slave to work as fast as possible. Rome had hundreds of these brothels. Every bathhouse doubled as one. Every tavern kept slaves on hand. For the average Roman man, buying sex from a slave was as ordinary as buying bread, but brothel slaves were only one category. Others lived in the households of the elite, facing horrors of a different kind. Among the wealthiest Romans, the most prized sex slaves were called deliciae, delights. These were usually children purchased before puberty, chosen for exceptional beauty, and groomed for their master's use. They lived in better conditions than brothel slaves. Fine clothes, better food, sometimes even education, but this came at a devastating cost. Their bodies were available at all times to their masters, and often to the master's friends. The poet Martial casually wrote about his deliciae, a boy named Dionysus, in ways we would today recognize as evidence of child abuse. At the time, it was celebrated as witty literature. When deliciae aged out of desirability, usually by their late teens, their fates varied. Some were discarded to brothels, a few lucky ones were kept as household slaves, an even smaller number were freed, often as a reward for years of service, but the psychological damage lasted a lifetime. This practice was so normalized that philosophers and emperors alike engaged in it without scandal. Nero even castrated a boy named Sporus, dressed him as a woman, and publicly married him. The cruelty wasn't the scandal, the excess theater was. Between wife and slave stood the concubine. These were sexual slaves who lived long-term with their masters, sometimes for decades. Unlike wives, they had no legal rights. Unlike brothel slaves, they might gain a degree of stability and even bear acknowledged children. Emperor Vespasian openly lived with his concubine Canis for years. Marcus Aurelius, the so-called philosopher king, kept a concubine after his wife's death. For some concubines, this role brought influence, wealth, or even affection. Educated Greek women were especially prized, able to converse on philosophy one moment and submit the next. But at the core, they remained property. They could be sold, discarded, or beaten at any time. Their children were slaves unless specifically freed. The line between love and ownership was blurred beyond recognition. Roman society developed entire categories of sex slaves. Meretrices puri, boy prostitutes prized in a culture where pederasty was celebrated. Spintri, slaves trained in elaborate sexual performances for orgies and banquets. Philautorces and cunnilingi, oral sex specialists, roles considered degrading, often branded on the forehead so no one forgot their function. Aquarioli, young boys who served wine naked at feasts, expected to provide entertainment between courses. Each category had its own price, training, and expected lifespan. Few made it past 30. The relentless grind of abuse, disease, and violence created a constant demand for new bodies. And here lies the most chilling truth. Roman law said slaves could not be sexualized. A master could do anything, to any slave, of any age, in any way. The only crime was damaging another man's property. This system wasn't chaotic. It was organized, taxed, and regulated like any industry. Brothels paid fees to the state. Slave dealers manipulated markets like modern stockbrokers. Specialist traders bleached skin with chemicals, removed body hair, and even castrated boys to keep them youthful. Survival rates for these surgeries were 50%. Survivors sold at premium prices. Legal cases survived that show how little slaves' lives mattered. If a sex slave injured a client, the owner paid damages. If a client killed a slave, he owed only the market value plus lost earnings. Religion offered no refuge. Even temples of Venus and Bacchus used slaves in ritual sex. Early Christianity, at first, didn't challenge the practice either. St. Paul told slaves to obey their masters, no exceptions. And yet, even in this nightmare, sex slaves found ways to resist. Some poisoned their masters using their intimate access as a weapon. Others spread disease deliberately or sabotaged clients. Graffiti in Pompeii reveals their voices. "I am yours for 2 asses," reads one, heartbreakingly casual. Another scrawled, "Africanus is dying here," a cry into history. Curse tablets have been found where slaves begged gods to strike down their abusers or end their lives quickly. These fragments are all we have of their voices, whispers in a society that erased them. Roman sex slavery didn't vanish overnight. It lasted for centuries, slowly declining as war captives became scarcer and Christianity gained influence. But even as public brothels closed, private abuse continued. And the legacy didn't end with Rome. Medieval Europe inherited practices of concubinage, prostitution, and sexual ownership. Today, modern human trafficking still echoes Rome's system. Younger victims, global networks, profit measured in billions. Rome teaches us a brutal lesson. A society can build aqueducts, libraries, and laws, while normalizing atrocity. civilization and barbarity can walk hand in hand. So when you walk through the ruins of Rome, past the Colosseum or the Forum, remember this: those stones were financed not only by conquest and trade, but by the systematic sexual exploitation of millions. Slaves reduced to bodies, bought and sold for pleasure, erased from history except in fragments of graffiti and ledgers of profit. Rome's greatness came with a human cost too big to measure, and its silence about that cost is the loudest testimony of all. If this story shocked you, good. It should, because history isn't just about glory, it's about the suffering that built it, and forgetting that suffering means repeating it. So I'll ask you again, before you go, drop a comment telling me the time where you are watching from. It helps this video reach more people, and lets us see this global community learning history together. And if you want more untold truths, the kind that change the way you see the past, subscribe, like this video, and share it, because the voices of Rome's forgotten millions deserve to be heard, even 2,000 years later.